In the Arizona desert, a detective needs to link a murderer to a crime scene. The only witnesses are two bean pods. A grotesque murder on a quiet beach has police baffled. A forensic geologist hopes to transform a spoonful of sand into a witness for the prosecution. After years of hunting for a clandestine grave, the only thing binding a killer to his victim is a tree root. In the past, rural landscapes have offered safe haven to murderers hoping to keep their crimes concealed. Now, thanks to the burgeoning fields of forensic botany and geology, the killer who puts his faith in nature's silence sows his own seeds of destruction. The Sonoran Desert. How many lives have been brutally ended in desolate landscapes like this one, with only an audience of trees to bear witness? Today, those unlikely observers are gaining a voice with which to expose the guilty. The Caterpillar Proving Grounds outside of Phoenix, Arizona, was a thrilling diversion for a man heading home one Sunday in May 1992. Cutting through a dry wash, he was struck by something out of place in the raw landscape. He moved in for a closer look. Face down, beneath a canopy of Palo Verde trees, lay the nude body of a woman. She wasn't breathing. Officers from the Maricopa County Sheriff's Department arrived at the scene. From the condition of the body, it appeared the victim had been murdered within the last 12 hours. Her clothing was scattered nearby. Braided wire and shoelaces were wrapped around her wrists and ankles. It seemed the killer had spent some time with the victim before leaving her here. Detective Charlie Norton led the investigation. The victim was identified by her fingerprints as 30-year-old Denise Johnson. She'd been arrested for prostitution. Hours passed as the team pored over the crime scene. They hoped to weave tatters of evidence into the coherent narrative of a homicide.
She had a white t-shirt, just an undershirt, was wrapped around her neck, and it looked like maybe she had been strangled.
As the team examined the torn clothes for clues, a fundamental piece of the puzzle came like a plea from beyond the grave. The insistent beeping from a pager broke the silence of the desert. Was some friend, unaware of Johnson's fate, trying to reach her? Or was this the forgotten property of a careless killer? A court order was obtained and the pager company contacted. The owner of the pager was traced through its ID number.
The pager subscriber was a fellow by the name of Earl Bogan, and he said that his son Mark had exclusive use of the pager because he didn't have any telephone communication, and basically that was the only way that the family had to get in touch with Mark.
While police processed the crime scene, a man came forward with a statement. At 1:30 the previous morning, he'd noticed something odd, a white pickup truck with amber clearance lights, whipping out of the proving grounds. The driver ran a stop sign, then flew toward the interstate. Combined with the pager information, this eyewitness testimony would give Norton a leg up on the investigation. When Norton learned that Mark Bogan owned a white pickup truck with amber clearance lights, it seemed to him he found the killer. He would now have to prove it.
Down this hallway.
Bogan, accompanied by his wife Rebecca, agreed to be interviewed at the sheriff's department.
I'm going to talk to her. I'm going to talk to him.
In an interview with police, recreated here, Rebecca said that on the night of the murder, Mark came home at 2 a.m., his face bloodied and scratched. He told Rebecca he'd been in a bar brawl. But Bogan told police a different story. He claimed he'd picked up a hitchhiker who fit Denise Johnson's description and had sex with her in his truck. Bogan admitted lying to his wife because he knew she'd be disgusted with the truth. The story was coming together a bit too neatly for Norton, and he wondered whether Bogan was twisting the facts to fit the evidence.
And I think somebody made contact with him and told him that the sheriff's office investigators were looking for him. So I think that kind of basically tipped him off, and he came up with this story.
According to Bogan, after their encounter, he and the hitchhiker argued. He ordered her out of the truck, and as she left, she swiped his wallet and pager. Bogan chased her and fought to recover the wallet. He claimed to have left Johnson on the side of the interstate, alive. Norton suspected that Bogan was telling only half the story.
I suspect probably that what Mark told me when I interviewed him, as far as picking her up, having an argument and so forth like that, I suspect all that's probably true. But the part that he left out is where it happened and that he ended up killing her.
Norton believed that Bogan was a murderer, but he wasn't getting any help from the suspect. Not only did Bogan adamantly deny killing Denise Johnson, it had been years, he claimed, since he'd even stepped foot in the Caterpillar proving grounds. Bogan's admission that he had spent the evening with Denise Johnson would, ironically, make it more difficult to prove that he had killed her.
We got nothing on this guy. Everything that he's told us shuts down all of our whole case. He had sex with her, he knows who she is, the whole shooting match.
Bogan's story, spotty as it was, had just defused an arsenal of forensic weaponry. DNA analysis of body fluids or fingernail scrapings could only prove something which Bogan had already admitted. On the evening of May 2nd, 1992, he and Denise Johnson had sex, then fought. Norton's only hope of bringing Bogan to justice would be to link him to the scene of the crime, a little patch of grass under a cluster of Palo Verde trees in the proving grounds. Bogan's truck was seized and searched, but nothing linking Bogan to Johnson's death was found. Two seemingly unexceptional Palo Verde seed pods were collected from the truck bed. But thousands of these trees grow in southern Arizona. The pods could have come from anywhere. It hardly seemed like the kind of evidence that could tie a man to a murder. Struggling for a way to link Bogan to the crime scene, Detective Norton returned to the proving grounds. Then, inspiration struck. Noticing a Palo Verde tree with a fresh scrape on it, he theorized that after dumping Johnson's body, Bogan's truck had brushed this tree, causing the pods to flutter free and land in his truck bed. If DNA testing could prove that the pods in Bogan's truck matched the scarred tree, Norton and his colleagues would be able to dismantle Bogan's alibi. But there was a problem. The test they envisioned had never been done before. To catch a killer, Detective Norton approached Timothy Helenjaris, Associate Professor of Molecular Genetics at the University of Arizona. Norton wanted to determine whether there was enough variability in Palo Verde DNA to distinguish one tree from another.
When I was contacted by the Sheriff's Department, they told me that they had some pods that were collected from the truck, and they thought they might have matched one of the trees at the site. They did remark that one of the trees had scrape marks, and so they had one particular tree in mind. So I asked them to collect pods from all the trees around the sites, but not to tell me which one was marked, and just to number them so it would be a blind study.
Using a cutting-edge technique called rapids for randomly amplified polymorphic DNA, Helenjaris rendered genetic profiles of sample trees and pods. The results were surprising. Palo Verde DNA appeared to be as complex as the human code. It seemed that individual trees could be easily distinguished from one another. Dr. Helenjaris first confirmed that the pods from Bogan's truck were from the same tree. He then compared that profile with DNA profiles from a lineup of 11 trees at the crime scene.
When we then informed the Sheriff's Department of which numbered tree it was, it turned out to be the one that in fact had the scrape marks on it that they were suspicious of to start with. So we felt pretty confident with our result there.
The noose was tightening around Mark Bogan's neck. He was arrested and a court date set. Armed with Helenjaris' findings, the prosecution was eager to confront the defendant with the silent testimony of a Palo Verde tree. But Bogan wasn't going down without a fight. To convict Mark Bogan of killing Denise Johnson, the prosecution hung their case on the admissibility of rapids, a legally unproven procedure. DNA analysis of humans had only been deemed admissible in Arizona courts a few months earlier. Using plant DNA to prove murder would be a stretch, and yet the entire case hinged on it. Bogan's defense team hired its own expert, Paul Keim of Northern Arizona University, to refute Helenjaris' findings in a pretrial hearing. If Keim could cast doubt on the validity of Helenjaris' technique, Bogan would likely walk out of court a free man.
So I think that the Bogan family hoped that my expert advice, expert opinion on the new DNA fingerprinting method that was being employed here would say that this was not a valid approach to forensic science, and that this was not conclusive evidence that their son had been at the crime scene. Hey, Jim,
though he was brought into the case as a hired gun for the defense, Dr. Keim's loyalty was to science and the responsible use of laboratory testing. His mistrust about rapids was valid. Since its debut, the new technique had been known to give false readings if the extremely careful controls aren't maintained throughout testing.
In my opinion, it meant that we had to hold it up to a very high standard of scrutiny, and so that it was important that we understood everything that was done here and that it was done correctly.
When performed with extreme care, Rapids provides researchers with an amazing new tool: the ability to look at an organism's DNA without any prior information about that species' genetic composition. The first step in the process is to get the DNA out of the pods. The seeds must be removed for accurate testing. Each represents a mixture of the tree's genetic material with the pollen that fertilized it, and would therefore introduce separate DNA into the test. Liquid nitrogen instantly freezes the pod so that it can be easily pulverized. Once it has been purified, the DNA is ready for PCR gene amplification. This heating process increases a minute sample of DNA to provide technicians with ample genetic material for testing. When reconstituted with water, the seed pod's DNA will be invisible to the eye, but extremely revealing in other ways. The Palo Verde sample is now ready to yield its genetic fingerprint. In order to make that pattern visible, a process called gel electrophoresis is used. Blue dye is added to the DNA sample, which is then inserted into the lanes on a jello-like slab. Exposure to an electrical field causes the fragments in the DNA to separate. The resulting barcode is then illuminated with UV light and photographed. When hired by Bogan's defense team, Keim had been skeptical about Rapid's ability to conclusively differentiate between Palo Verde trees. But when he studied Dr. Helenjaris's data and the painstaking process by which he collected it, he was surprised at how definitive the results were. Influenced by his colleagues' findings, Keim was won over to the prosecution's side, and under oath, he couldn't refute the results. In Keim's opinion, the tree and the pod matched to a great degree of certainty. The defense team now faced an insurmountable setback by the researchers' fidelity to science. Bogan was going down.
When I examined the scientific evidence, the first thing that was most obvious to me is that the DNA from the pod that was found in Bogan's truck did in fact have exactly the same DNA fingerprint pattern as one of the trees where the body was found.
Helenjaris and Keim had placed Mark Bogan at the crime scene. After he had killed Denise Johnson, Bogan backed his truck into a tree and shook loose the evidence that would later convict him. The unrefuted genetic findings decimated the foundation of Bogan's defense. Bogan was convicted of murder and sent to prison for life. Helenjaris's trailblazing research established botanical DNA profiling as an effective forensic tool, giving a voice to two tiny seed pods without whose testimony a murderer would still be walking among us. A world away from the Arizona desert, New England's coastline can be as desolate a place to die as the barren Sonora landscape. But like those seemingly inconsequential Palo Verde pods, grains of sand can be made to talk. On the morning of June 30th, 1994, a woman and her two nephews roamed Crescent Beach in Rhode Island. Buried treasure was the children's goal. What they found instead seemed to have been buried alive. Detective Arthur Clark of the East Providence Police Department was called to investigate the buried woman at the beach. The scene was more reminiscent of a Stephen King novel than anything the veteran detective had seen in person. 2 feet beneath the surface lay a woman in a red satin cocktail dress. Her life had been ended by multiple blows to the head.
We arrived on the scene about 10:15. We verified they were human arms. It appeared a body was buried in a shallow grave. We notified the medical examiner's office, who responded.
The victim's arms jutted out from beneath the sand, her hands clawing skyward in what seemed a final grasp for life. It seemed unlikely that she'd been buried alive. The medical examiner concluded that in her condition, the victim wouldn't have the strength to push her hands up through the sand. Someone had posed her into this final gesture, like a scene from a horror film. The killer seemed to be leaving a calling card, but his message was inscrutable. A circular pattern had been pressed into the sand around the body. In it lay a shattered watch face, its hands frozen at midnight. But for detectives, time raced forward. It seemed that some sort of grotesque ritual was performed here. They feared it could be the beginning of killings to come. They needed to work quickly before this killer struck again. At this early stage of investigation, vital clues might be masquerading as common trash. Cigarette butts, candy wrappers, and plastic cups were collected from the scene, along with samples of sand from both the surface and the bottom of the grave.
At the time, we didn't know what was evidence and what was not. So on the side of caution, we collected what we thought could end up being evidence.
Once we put the tape out, there's been nobody else in the area.
But before Clark could make sense of the eerie spectacle, he'd have to learn more about the victim. He didn't have to look far.
At around 8 o'clock that evening, a gentleman by the name of Christopher Hutter, who lived in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, called the Pawtucket police to report his wife missing.
The missing woman was 30-year-old Kendra Hutter. From a photograph, Clark recognized her as the murder victim. According to her husband, Kendra and he had lived more like roommates than lovers. Beyond the facade of domestic contentment dwelt a loveless marriage, bound together by financial need and parental obligation. They agreed to date other people. Christopher Hutter told police that Kendra had a date the night she died. Police later learned she met him through a personal ad. The divorced white male described himself as a cheerful, attractive father. Hoping to add a dash of romance to her life, she contacted him and they arranged for a date. On the night of June 29th, Kendra scribbled the man's name and phone number for her husband. The card read, Gary. Detective Clark identified Gary as Gary Tassone, a truck driver who lived with his mother and brother in Cumberland. He told police that he'd had 3 dates with Kendra Hutter, but denied having been with her on the night of her murder. The personable Tassone did his best to help Clark, telling police that he knew Kendra and her husband were having marital trouble. He suggested that perhaps the disgruntled Christopher Hutter was the murderer. When Tassone told Clark he'd been to the beach where the body was found, Clark asked him to come to the station to continue questioning.
After taking his first statement, there were several things that didn't jive. There were some inconsistencies in what he told us and what we had learned up until then.
In an interview with police, recreated here, Tassone adamantly denied having been with Kendra Hutter the night of the murder. As the interview wore on, however, he revised his story. He admitted he'd been on a date with her that night, but dropped her off around 11 o'clock. But that contradicted what Kendra's husband reported. According to him, Kendra never made it home that night. As far as they could tell, Tassone was the last person to see the victim alive. The detectives pressed on.
Detective Bilodeau and I spoke to him on and off for about 4 hours that evening. He never displayed any signs of emotion. He spoke very well. He was articulate, polite, cool, calm. He was not nervous at all. Pretty just matter of fact.
Clark continued to question Tassone, and as the interview moved into its 5th grueling hour, Tassone finally offered up an account. He and Kendra had been building sand castles when a noise startled him, causing him to inadvertently strike her in the head. In a panic, he buried the body in the sand. Considering the extent of Kendra Hutter's injuries, 7 strikes to the head, Clark rejected the story. There was no question in the detective's mind that the victim was killed intentionally.
What is it? What's wrong?
We don't know why she was murdered, but it was no accident.
On the surface, it seemed that Tassone was beginning to cooperate, but his statement made no sense, and Clark didn't know what to make of it. The tale he told of accidental death was far-fetched and implausible, but probably reflected a skewed version of what really happened. From what Clark had already learned of the case, Tassone was sprinkling his narrative with blatant lies. The resulting story was more confusion than confession. If only Clark could sift through the fantasy and get to the truth, he'd have the case sewn up. For now, Clark had to follow along and see where Tassone would take him. Under the guise of cooperation, the suspect led police to a roadside embankment where he said he ditched the shovel. It seemed like just another delay tactic, but a shovel did indeed turn up. With this discovery, the evidence seemed to be stacked on Clark's side. He had a murder victim buried in a ritualistic fashion. He had the alleged murder weapon. He had a suspect who could link the two together. But Clark only had Tassone's unlikely story to place him at the crime scene. To make the charges stick, he needed to construct a more coherent account of what happened. Armed with a warrant, police searched Tassone's car. The findings were slim, amounting to little more than a scattering of sand. It seemed Clark had found all the evidence there was to find. It was time to go to court. But at the start of the criminal trial in January of 1997, Tassone began to backpedal. Claiming to have been coerced into confession in exchange for immunity, Tassone recanted his story and explained away the sand in his trunk as having come from an evening with another woman at the beach. The shovel, he said, was just a shovel. Police couldn't disprove it. Suddenly, Detective Clark found the tide was turning against him. Without Gary Tassone's confession, Detective Clark and the Rhode Island police had to treat the case as if they'd never had a confession at all. To link Tassone to the crime scene, Clark needed solid evidence, but all he had was a handful of sand. Clark knew the answer was written here, but he wasn't able to read it. To build a case on such unusual evidence was beyond the resources of his small department. He had to call in the experts. He sent the physical evidence to the FBI's Forensic Geology Lab, the only one of its kind in the country. There, geologist Bruce Hall examined the shovel, the blanket, debris from the crime scene, and the sand recovered from Tassone's vehicle.
The contributor, East Providence, Rhode Island, asked that we compare any soil or sand recovered from any of those items with some known samples of sand that they had recovered from the crime scene. In this situation, it was a beach.
To see the past in a grain of sand, that is Hall's mission. Each grain is a world unto itself, differing not only across continents, but across the length and breadth of a shoreline as well. Every child knows that sand on the surface of a beach is different from sand below. But what few criminals realize is that these differences can be measured and compared.
We have known soil samples from the grave. We have some, because it is a grave, we're dealing in 3 dimensions. We have some that were taken a number of different locations on the surface of the earth. As now we have a profile, if you will. We've got a hole in the ground that may be 1, 2, 3 foot deep. We have a number of samples now from various depths.
If the grains of sand found in the suspect's car came from the bottom of the excavated grave rather than the beach surface, as Tassone claimed, Hall would soon find out. To catch Tesson, Hall concentrated on the sand samples taken from the bottom of the victim's grave. If sand on any of Tesson's possessions matched it, Clark would have his case. Geologic examination takes a three-pronged approach. Samples are compared according to color, texture, and composition. The analysis begins with a careful look at color. This first test requires no sophisticated equipment, but it's essential for ruling out samples that would have no bearing on Tesson's case.
Would view these under a number of different lighting conditions, daylight, again, fluorescent light, incandescent light, and compare their color. This soil representing soil recovered from the shovel, dissimilar to that collected from the beach. The blanket, again, at arm's length, we can see there's a color difference. This soil did not originate from the same source as the known soil. However, when we take a look at the soil from a vehicle, they're strikingly similar with respect to color.
The color comparison demonstrated that, judging from the sand grain evidence, the shovel may not have been involved in the crime. Or Tesson may have used it elsewhere before ditching it. It seemed like just another red herring Tesson threw out to get police off his scent. Tesson won that battle, but not the war. The sand from his car matched the color of the sand collected from the bottom of the grave. Hall moved on to phase 2 with this sample, analyzing texture. The sand is rinsed with water and exposed to ultrasonic waves, which vibrate off any silt or clay clinging to the sample. The sample is dried and placed under a stereo microscope. Now, Hall looks at the size and texture of the grains. A well-sorted sample consists of same-sized grains, like table salt, whereas a poorly sorted sample contains a variety of sizes, like a can of mixed nuts. Hall also looks at the shapes of the individual grains. Are they round, angular, or oval, for example? In the sand from Tesson's car, the grains were mixed consistently. The sample was said to be well sorted and made up of well-rounded grains. So was the sample taken from the bottom of the grave. The walls were closing in on Gary Tesson, but Hall still had one more test to perform. He examined the soil samples under a polarized light microscope to determine their mineral composition. Different minerals have different optical properties when exposed to polarized light. These characteristics enable Hall to identify them.
Characterizing minerals is fundamentally no different than characterizing an individual. How tall is that individual? How much do they weigh? What is their hair color, eye color? And you characterize a mineral in the same fashion.
The sample from Tesson's trunk was composed predominantly of quartz, with a small amount of the mineral feldspar. When he looked at the sand from the bottom of Kendra Hutter's grave under the same conditions, he found the samples matched. Bruce Hall had now proven that Gary Tesson was in fact with Kendra Hutter on the beach the night she died. And, more than that, he proved that Tesson buried her body. Based largely on the strength of Bruce Hall's forensic evidence, the jury found Gary Tesson guilty of first-degree murder. He is serving a life sentence without parole. The strange man had lured a woman from the personal ads, beaten her in the head with a shovel almost 20 times, and buried her in a way sure to be noticed. The motive and meaning of his crime remain a mystery. Also unknown is whether this was the first strike of Gary Tesson. As he drove his truck across the country, did he place ads in other papers, luring unsuspecting women like Kendra Hutter to their deaths? Or was his first victim also his last? Though the grave markers may be erased by time, nature doesn't forget death. The world is forever changed for the family of a murder victim. The same holds true for the landscape in which a body is buried. 20-year-old Cher Elder was known around the Denver suburb of Lakewood, Colorado, as having a mind of her own. It didn't make for smooth relationships. On the evening of March 27, 1993, she had a skirmish with her boyfriend, Byron Powers. No doubt apologies follow after a few hours of downtime. To blow off some steam, Cher caught a ride to Central City, a seedy gambling town 1 hour's drive into the Rockies. Her escort, an older man, was good company, and her moodiness lifted as the night wore on. At 1:40 the next morning, Cher and her companion left the casino. She would soon join the ranks of the missing. Days passed with no sign of Cher. Her frantic father reported her missing to the Lakewood Police Department. Detective Scott Richardson was assigned to the case. Missing person cases are a tricky call. Richardson didn't want to throw his department's resources behind a massive search, only to find that the time and energy had been misspent on a girl who'd left town to cool off.
It's a tough investigation. How involved do you want to get on a missing person case, and how complex do you want to make a missing person case to find out they're laying out on the beach in Maui somewhere?
Richardson had a bad feeling, however, that Cher wasn't on vacation. His first objective was to identify the man with whom she'd last been seen. A surveillance camera at the casino had captured his image.
We did not know who that male was, and that was the last time she was seen alive. A friend of hers had seen her in the casino with this male.
The man was identified as Thomas Luther, an acquaintance of Cher's boyfriend, Byron Powers. Cher had been introduced to the older man shortly before her unlucky gambling trip to Central City. The more he learned about Thomas Luther, the more Richardson sensed that he was no longer looking for a missing person. He was now looking for a body. In Thomas Luther, Cher had picked the wrong shoulder to cry on. A known sex offender, Luther was fresh off a 10-year prison sentence for attacking and raping a young woman. He had bragged in jail that when he got out, the police wouldn't find the next woman he killed. This time, he'd be sure to bury the body where it would never be found. Richardson set out to foil that plan.
Our focus of the case at that time was to try to find the body of Cher Elder for two reasons. We needed it for prosecution and the family.
Richardson questioned Luther, who claimed that after leaving the casino, he dropped Elder off at her boyfriend's house. Luther's car was seized and searched for evidence, but nothing suggesting murder was found. For weeks, Richardson pressed on. Though he had very little hard evidence, knowing that this girl's body was out there somewhere kept the detective searching. To outsmart a clever criminal like Luther, Richardson would need to raise the suspect's level of uneasiness, hopefully compelling him back to the gravesite for a cautious once-over.
The prior day, I called Luther up at home and intentionally meant to sound really confident. I told him, hey, we got some evidence and I want you here at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, hoping that it would increase his anxiety and he would make a mistake.
Richardson succeeded in flushing his quarry out of the brush. An informant told him that Luther planned to return to the grave early the following morning. If the body had been dug up, he planned to flee the state immediately. Meanwhile, undercover officers cast a wide net over the metropolitan Denver area, tailing Luther's acquaintances and scouting major roads. The morning of his meeting with Richardson, police observed a man in a car parked beside the road. Soon, police saw Luther emerge from the woods and get into the car. He proceeded to his meeting with Richardson, cocky with the knowledge that his pursuer was bluffing. Without a body, Richardson couldn't hold Luther. He was bound by law to release him and his car. Months passed without any progress on the case. Meantime, the prime suspect moved out of state. With each passing day, the more likely it seemed that Cher Elder's demise would forever remain a secret between the killer and the victim. The only thing keeping Richardson going was the faith that Cher Elder was buried somewhere in Empire Valley. But finding her in the craggy lowland would be an arduous task.
This valley is about 15 miles in length. And as you get out there, when you start looking for a possible location of the grave, it's nothing but rock slides and piles of rocks. And there's so many potential areas that a body could be hidden in that it just became a maze.
Weeks of foraging around Empire Valley left detectives empty-handed and frustrated. Finding Cher Elder's body in this rough terrain required a kind of expertise that would tax the resources of almost any police department.
Was that any good? Yes. Hopefully we would.
Aware that he'd reached his department's limits, Detective Richardson was running out of options. But he wasn't quite ready to throw in the towel. The relentless detective had one final inspiration. He contacted NecroSearch, an elite corps of scientists that uses a wide range of disciplines to locate clandestine graves.
NecroSearch exists because a group of law enforcement officers and scientists got together and figured there had to be a better way to find murdered or buried people and evidence.
Towards that goal, NecroSearch has assembled leading scientists from all over Colorado, comprising 15 specialties, including botany, geology, geophysics, forensic anthropology, and entomology.
53972.
The fundamental premise of NecroSearch is that buried bodies change the ecosystem around them forever. The soil above a grave may sag under rain or snow. Specific vegetation may flourish on the decomposing body.
53969.
Insects and scavengers arrive.
This is a case of a lifetime. This took everything that we had, everything that we could use of other sources from other agencies. That's why NecroSearch was requested to come in and assist. It was real simple. We're a largely populated community here. We're in the metro Denver area. We don't have expertise in going out looking for graves. We don't have very many graves dug in the city.
So far, the all-volunteer NecroSearch team has participated in over 100 cases in 30 states and 7 countries. The group convenes monthly to review potential cases. For most petitioners, like Detective Richardson, NecroSearch represents a final glimmer of hope.
I was asked by NecroSearch to come to their meeting and present the case to see if it was something that NecroSearch could assist me in. And so the case presentation was made to NecroSearch at that time. And boy, they asked me questions that I'd never thought of, such as what color was the dirt on Luther's pants when he came to get his car, because that may indicate he crawled out of a mine shaft or he may have been in a sand pit. And it was pretty apparent right then that when I contacted NecroSearch, these are the people that can help me because they have the experience in trying to locate a grave.
The rocky terrain hampered the endeavor, making disturbances in the soil difficult to spot. The team probed the earth for clues undetectable to the human eye.
On the geology side, we're looking for disturbances in the layering.
And everything is layered. You wouldn't think so, but you come out here, you dig down a few feet, you'll find various layers within the rock, or within the soil, and we're looking to see where that's been disturbed.
Ground sweeps, aerial searches, and infrared analysis ruled out many potential grave sites. But still, as the months passed, no body was found. It seemed like Thomas Luther's boast about outsmarting police was coming true. In late January of 1995, a tip led Detective Richardson and NecroSearch to a steep, piney slope off the highway. Rocks covered most of the area. A grave could be disguised anywhere. NecroSearch did some preliminary testing of the location, but were shut down because of weather. It was now nearly 2 years after Cher's disappearance.
You don't like me and I don't like you, and that ain't no...
Then, a crucial break came. Byron Powers, Cher's boyfriend, landed in prison for assault. It seemed Cher had a fatal lapse of judgment in her choice of companions. In an effort to lessen the charges against him, Powers dangled a piece of information in front of the police. He said he knew that Luther had killed Cher Elder, and he knew where he'd buried her body. Powers had been there about 3 weeks after Cher's death to help Luther better conceal the grave. Powers directed Richardson right past the point where the NecroSearch team had given up. Unlike most killers who hastily dump bodies downhill, Luther had taken his time in selecting a grave that would seem an improbable choice to police.
What we ultimately learned is that Thomas Luther carried the body of Cher Elder straight up a hillside by a rock slide and went uphill, which is uncommon.
The pile of rocks that Powers pointed out was less than a foot from the place that Richardson and NecroSearch had been testing shortly before the weather had forced them to quit.
We were 2 inches from the body of Cher Elder when we quit digging the first time. We went back, excavated to remove the body of Cher Elder.
As if setting up an archaeological excavation, the team established a grid and embarked upon an old-style dig. Laboriously, the team scraped soil 10 centimeters at a time. Archaeologist Steve Ireland was part of the search for Cher Elder's remains.
There, the initial 2 or 3 inches of ground was frozen. It was, January or February, as I recall. And so there we had to use a pick in order to get that top couple of inches, which was frozen off.
After 4 days and 2 feet of digging, the team reached bone. Excavated with fine hand tools like whisk brooms, toothbrushes, and bamboo sticks, the remains of a body finally took shape in the frozen soil. Dental records would identify the body as Cher Elder. Preliminary autopsy results showed that the young woman had been shot in the head 3 times, execution style. This discovery might have been enough evidence to convince a jury that Luther had killed Elder. But prosecutors would have a much better chance if they knew the time of death. If the body had been buried at least 2 years ago, a time when Cher was known to have been with Luther, the charge of murder would be much easier to prove in court. The team's careful excavation uncovered a clump of plant roots growing into the victim's soft flesh. NecroSearch called in botanist Vicki Trammell to extract and preserve them. Could she determine the time of burial from this botanical evidence?
When digging is done and roots are cut, this stimulates growth of new roots into the fresh backfill dirt. So the idea was that these roots ought to be about the same general age as the grave.
In order to determine the age of the new growth, the roots were sent to a lab where they were cut crosswise and stained, highlighting the characteristics of the cells. Most woody species of trees, like the pines and firs that forested the area near the victim's grave, form their roots in the same way, and the new roots have a particular pattern of cells that can be recognized under the microscope. Most of the differences involve the xylem, which is the water-conducting tissue in the plant.
And what I'm seeing is the water-conducting tissue kind of in a triangle. And it's the triangle shape that tells me that that is a very young root, about a first-year root.
Another year's growth sees a significant change in the cells. The triangle of tissue gives way to larger water-conducting cells.
This tells me it's a secondary root.
From their cellular structure, Trammell estimated the roots to be 2 years old. Her findings sealed the case against Thomas Luther, proving the grave was dug at a time after he was released from jail and known to be with the victim. In the end, a jury was convinced that Thomas Luther killed Cher Elder. He was sentenced to 48 years in prison with no chance of parole. Thanks to the tireless pursuit of Scott Richardson and the cutting-edge forensics of the NecroSearch team, the odyssey had finally come to an end.
I myself don't believe in what they call closure. I believe if you lose a loved one, that you will feel that loss for the rest of your life. But at least if they know what happened, they possibly can get on with their life in some way.
After the case ended, NecroSearch paid Detective Richardson the ultimate honor and inducted him into their selective ranks. Without his determination, Cher Elder would still be hidden in a desolate grave. The Earth is an impartial eyewitness to murder. But forensic botany and geology are finding ways to gather its testimony. Crimes considered unsolvable a few years earlier are now being won on the basis of roots, seeds, and sand. The landscape has become grounds for conviction, but we've only begun to scratch the surface. Firefighters extinguish a blazing house in the nick of time, exposing the murders the fire was meant to conceal. A woman's death in her bathtub looks like an accident, at least at first. Investigating a reported suicide, police in New Orleans find certain details suspiciously out of place. Killers can be masters at disguising their crimes, even when their victims are in plain sight. It takes a vigilant investigator to realize that first impressions are often dead wrong. In the small town of Benton, Virginia, on August 29, 1994, a passing motorist saw smoke rising from a house just before dawn. Firefighters battled the blaze for several hours before bringing it under control.
Okay, can you give me your status? You making any headway on the fire? Yeah, we got most of it knocked down. We're still negative on a search.
The patterns of the burns and the speed at which the fire spread told them this was arson. Had the motorist not called when he did, the house and all it contained would have been destroyed beyond recognition. The fire team was not in time to save the family who lived there. 4 people, including 2 small children, were dead.
11C, go ahead, back your hay line out of the building.
But once the smoke cleared and smoldering ruins were examined, it became apparent that this family did not die in the fire. Downstairs, Teresa Hodges had been strangled. Upstairs, 11-year-old Winter Hodges and 3-year-old Anna Hodges had been shot. In the master bedroom, the body of their father, Blaine Hodges, was found with a single gunshot to the head. A .22 caliber pistol without a barrel lay near his body. Special Agent Barry Cassee of the Virginia State Police had a theory about what happened.
It was pretty obvious that the evidence was just screaming, that's the words I use, of murder-suicide. And as the morning wore on, it became even more evident that it was a murder-suicide.
Blaine Hodges had recently been convicted of embezzling from his employer, the United States Postal Service. Police believed that Blaine, despondent over his impending prison sentence, had killed his wife and his children. Then he doused their home with fuel oil, set it afire, and shot himself in the head. At autopsy, Dr. David Oxley, Deputy Chief Medical Examiner of Western Virginia, began to doubt the murder-suicide theory.
Well, when I examined the bodies, all 4 of the bodies, I noticed the thing that struck me was that the man, Blaine Hodges, had been dead considerably longer than the other 3. The body of Mr. Hodges was quite decomposed. The other bodies were not. What do we know so far?
Oxley told Special Agent Cassee that Blaine Hodges couldn't have killed his family.
24 to 36 hours, find out what
He'd died at least 12 hours earlier than they did. The gun collected at the scene also raised questions. The bullets retrieved from the victims were all .22 caliber, the same as the pistol retrieved next to Blaine Hodges. The pistol's serial number had been filed off, making it impossible to trace. Its missing barrel also hampered investigators. A gun barrel leaves spiral marks called lands and grooves on every bullet that passes through. The bullets recovered from the victims had these markings, meaning they came from a gun with a barrel. Forensic Supervisor William Conrad of the Virginia Division of Forensic Science was convinced that someone besides Blaine Hodges must have pulled the trigger.
With the barrel removed and rifling being present on the father's bullet that was taken from his head, would indicate right away that he could not have fired that shot. There's no way he could have shot himself in the head and then removed the barrel. That wouldn't have happened.
Conrad wasn't convinced this was even the real murder weapon. The bullets taken from the bodies were marked with 6 lands and grooves. Reference manuals for the gun found at the crime scene showed its normal pattern would be 8 lands and grooves. Conrad concluded the gun found at the crime scene was merely a drop gun, intended to fool the police.
At a crime scene, if you're trying to frame someone or try to cover something up, you would drop a gun that's unrelated to the incident and try to trick us into thinking that was the actual weapon.
What looked like a murder-suicide at the crime scene had morphed into plain murder in the forensics lab. Aside from tipping detectives off, the gun was of little use at this stage in the investigation. They had no suspects, no ballistics to compare, and apparently not even the murder weapon. All that detectives could be sure of was that someone else had killed the family, then tried to make it appear like murder-suicide. The killer had hoped the flames would consume the evidence. Detectives sifting through the ashes at the crime scene now had a new assignment: to smoke out the killer. Police had no idea who killed the Hodges and their two daughters. They questioned friends, hoping to gather clues about their enemies. Their closest friend was a man named Earl Bramblett. He frequently stayed with the family. The kids called him Uncle Earl. Police asked Bramblett to come to the station and talk with them. He seemed genuinely upset about the deaths. But in the course of his interview, an offhanded comment caught investigators by surprise.
He spontaneously made a comment, and he said that sorry SOB, he had a beautiful family, he did them and did himself. Well, at that moment, I knew Mr. Bramblett was probably involved in the murders of the Hodges family. I knew that in order for somebody to know that outside of the police, that they would have had to have been in there when the murders occurred.
The media hadn't reported the murder-suicide story, and the police hadn't mentioned it to anyone outside of the force. Bramblett had revealed a detail only the killer would have known. Gussie kept his suspicions to himself. He needed more evidence before he could act on them. Bramblett agreed to come in for another interview later. When he failed to show, the police went to the motel where he was staying since he had no fixed address. When he didn't answer the door, the detectives obtained a room key from the motel manager to make sure he was all right. Bramblett arrived just in time to stop them. Now belligerent, he dared them to place him under arrest. To the police, he was behaving like a man who was guilty.
You want to arrest? You think I've done something wrong?
And who believed the police would never be able to prove it. Bramblett's own words had made him a suspect, but words alone proved nothing. 3 days after the Hodges family were killed, police set up a roadblock in front of the house. The fire had started around 4:30 a.m. By stopping cars around that time, they hoped to find someone who may have passed the house just before it burned. A woman told police she saw a vehicle pull out of the Hodges' driveway at the time of the fire. She noticed the vehicle because it was so unusual, an old white pickup truck with a black tailgate. She did not notice the license number or the driver.
Earl, said we'd be back. A search warrant to look at your truck and your room. Care to read it?
While the roadblock was taking place, police returned to Bramblett's motel room with a search warrant. As Bramblett stood by, they searched for anything that might suggest his involvement in the deaths of Blaine Hodges and his family. Outside stood his white pickup truck with its distinctive black tailgate. In the front seat, police saw several .22 caliber shell casings. They were the same brand and caliber as the casings found at the murder scene. When the firing pin strikes a bullet, it leaves a distinct impression on the cartridge casing. William Conrad hoped to compare the casings from the crime scene with the ones found in Bramblett's truck. Once again, he found the killer was one step ahead of him. He'd obscured the marks on the cartridges.
It looked like someone had placed it in, fired the gun, took them out, placed them again, and fired them. Again, it indicated that someone was trying to manipulate the evidence after the fact to try to confuse the laboratory and what was going on.
Conrad would not be so easily thwarted. Among the hash of wayward marks, he looked for similarities between the cartridges retrieved from the truck and those from the murder scene.
We can put the marks together, see the reproducible patterns that are present, and be able to say that the marks that you see represented on both of them were made by the same firing pin impression.
After close scrutiny, he found what he was looking for. One of the cartridges from the crime scene had a strike mark identical to a cartridge from Bramblett's truck.
And I found enough of those individual characteristics that I was able to say that both of them had been fired by the same firing pin, to the exclusion of any others.
The cartridge casings were definitely used in the same gun, linking the drop gun to Bramblett. But that wasn't enough. Conrad still needed to find the gun that fired the fatal bullets. Meantime, detectives worked the case from another angle, trying to find out if Bramblett could have been the one who set the fire. The killer had torched the house around 4:30 a.m. on Monday, August 29th. To check Bramblett's whereabouts at that time, police went to the sign company where he worked. They learned he was scheduled to be at work at 5 a.m. the day of the fire.
The same employee that routinely checks the time cards checked Mr. Bramlett's. Mr. Bramlett's card had been obliterated. That the time that he punched in on Monday morning, August the 29th, had been blacked out where you couldn't read what time he might have punched in.
Police called on handwriting expert Gordon Menzies to find out what was under the marking.
Using infrared lighting techniques, I was able to separate the ink of the overwritten entry or the obliterating entry and come up with an entry of 508 M, which was apparently 8 minutes after 5 Monday.
The time card confirmed that Bramblett arrived at work after the blaze was set. But that didn't prove he was the one who set it. It only proved he had time to do it. The search for more evidence continued. Bramblett's employer told police that the morning after police searched Bramblett's motel room, Earl arrived at work seething with rage. 1 hour later, a co-worker noticed water running under a door. He found a pair of blue jeans thought to be Bramblett's. They smelled of the solvent used at the sign company. The manager thought them important enough to turn over to the police. Authorities hoped the jeans still held some clue to link Bramblett to the fire. Scientists analyzed them and the water they were soaking in. To identify the chemicals in the fabric, the jeans were placed in a canister with a solvent called pentane. After they had soaked for 15 minutes, the pentane was poured off. The solvent evaporated under a fume hood, leaving behind a soup of the compounds from the jeans. The liquid was placed in a gas chromatograph. A readout identified each compound soaked out of the jeans. One was a commercial solvent used by the sign company. The other was fuel oil, like that used to douse the home of the murder victims. Investigators believed that Bramblett had tried to rinse the oil-soaked jeans clean, carelessly leaving them where anyone could find them. Though the jeans were potential evidence, they were, like everything else so far, circumstantial. Investigators pressed on. Hoping that Bramblett's carelessness didn't stop there, they looked for more evidence in the dumpster at the sign company. Along with documents belonging to Bramblett, they found a T-shirt bearing the words William Byrd High School, class of 2001. One of the murder victims, 11-year-old Winter Hodges, owned such a T-shirt. It was missing from the crime scene and unaccounted for. The shirt found in the dumpster had apparently belonged to the victim. investigators were encouraged. Only Bramblett would have had access to both the shirt and the dumpster. Still, it proved no wrongdoing. As the investigation into the deaths of the Hodges continued, Bramblett left town for good. Though Virginia police never let him out of their sight, they believed they had nothing to hold him. They didn't realize they had what they needed all along. Police were reasonably certain that Earl Bramblett killed the Hodges family, but that means nothing in a court of law. To prove it, they had to place him at the scene. The gun seemed to be the crucial element. They just didn't know how it fit. The killer had taken pains to make sure the weapon couldn't be identified. Without a serial number, it couldn't be traced. Without a barrel, investigators had no way to perform a ballistics test. They had no reason to believe that the gun from the crime scene was the murder weapon. According to William Conrad's reference manual, a bullet fired from this gun would show 8 lands and grooves. The bullets recovered from the Hodges showed only 6. The weapon sat on a shelf for a year while the case against Bramblett stalled. Then, on an unrelated investigation, Conrad ran across a weapon of the same brand as the gun in the Bramblett case. He test-fired the gun and was surprised to find that the bullets had 6 lands and grooves instead of 8. The reference manual had been wrong. Conrad now knew that the gun found in the Hodges house most likely was the murder weapon. The killer had removed its barrel because he thought it would make the gun untraceable. But through the cartridge casings and other forensic evidence, police found their man. By linking the gun to Earl Bramblett, the police had gathered the final piece of evidence they needed to prove he was the killer. Then, his sister in Indiana provided information about the possible motive. Bramblett, apparently feeling threatened, had sent her a huge number of audio tapes for safekeeping. He told her to send them to police if something happened to him. When she heard her brother was in trouble, she forwarded them to the Virginia authorities. In his audio-taped diaries, Bramblett spoke of his more than casual attraction to the Hodges' 11-year-old daughter. Bramblett had once been a suspect in the disappearance of 2 small children, but his involvement had never been proved. According to the tapes, Bramblett began to believe that Blaine Hodges, faced with prison for embezzling, had become a police informant. In his delusions, Bramblett had decided Blaine was using his daughter to entrap Bramblett as a child molester. The police believed that on Saturday, August 27, 1994, Bramblett had been visiting Blaine at his home. While Teresa Hodges and her children were out shopping, he took his .22 Magnum pistol and shot Blaine in the head. According to friends who saw them later that day, Bramblett told Teresa when she came home from shopping that Blaine, despondent over going to prison, needed some time by himself.
Blaine took off.
Like the good uncle he pretended to be, he bundled Teresa and the children into his truck and took them camping in the nearby mountains. As Blaine Hodges lay dead in an upstairs bedroom, his wife and children went off with his killer. They would have only a 24-hour reprieve. The next day, Bramblett would resume his killing by strangling Teresa Hodges. Having killed both parents, Bramblett saved his last horrifying act of violence for the children. He then put the murder weapon next to Blaine Hodges' body to make it appear that Blaine had killed his family, then himself. He was sure the fuel he spread throughout the house would ignite an all-consuming fire, that the police would buy the theory of murder-suicide. But Bramblett had no sooner made his getaway than a passing motorist spotted the flame. Fire Department. Special Agent Barry Cassie acknowledges that Bramblett almost got away with it.
But his primary plan was, if the police buy this murder-suicide, I'm home free. And look, he would have been home free. But see, he did not know that the Benton Fire Department had responded in such a short order that they preserved the bodies upstairs.
It took the police almost 2 years to build their case. Bramblett had relocated to South Carolina, but the Virginia authorities had never lost his trail. He was arrested in July 1996, convicted of 4 counts of murder and sentenced to death. Killers can disguise their crimes in many ways, but the truth often lies just below the surface. On April 29, 1997, police in the suburban Philadelphia community of Marion, Pennsylvania, arrived at the house of Craig Rabinowitz. He'd called 911 to report his wife unconscious in the bathtub. They found Rabinowitz clutching his wife, Stephanie, still in the tub where he'd found her. He told police he'd discovered his wife on her side, her head underwater. He had no idea what caused his wife to drown. Paramedics tried to revive her, but she was dead. Detective Charlie Craig saw no signs of foul play in the death of Mrs. Rabinowitz.
My initial impression of the cause of death, after looking at Stephanie, after viewing her at the emergency ward, and after talking with the emergency ward doctor, was that it was an unexplained death or it was an accident.
All right, here we go.
What are you doing?
Oh, come on.
Friends and relatives mourned the untimely death of a woman in the prime of life. Craig and Stephanie had met when he was a camp counselor and she was still a teenager. After they married, Stephanie went to law school and had a promising career as an attorney. To their friends, they seemed an ideal couple. Now, their happiness had come to a tragic end. Craig told police that on the night of his wife's death, he was watching a hockey game while she took a bath. He heard a thump coming from the bathroom, like the sound of a shampoo bottle hitting the floor. When his wife failed to emerge from the bath after 35 minutes, he went to check on her. That's when he found her submerged in the water, her face blue. He tried desperately to bring her back to life, then called 911. Detectives have an eye for inconsistencies. And though they had no reason to doubt that the death was an accident, one fact seemed bothersome. The paramedics mentioned that the victim was wearing jewelry, including a watch. Charlie Craig's partner, Detective Richard Peffel, asked some of his female friends if they bathed with their jewelry.
And almost exclusively, every woman said, absolutely not. The first one I did was the first night I got home about 4 a.m. and I woke up my wife from a dead sleep. Nance, if you took a bath, would you wear all of your jewelry? And she looked at me and said, no, why? And I said, don't worry about it, go back to sleep.
That eccentric detail motivated investigators to look for other inconsistencies. They checked the hospital records. Again, something didn't sit right. After death, a body's temperature normally drops at the rate of 1 degree per hour, even faster if it's sitting in water. When the victim arrived at the hospital, her temperature was only 1 degree below normal, indicating she died just 10 minutes before the call to 911. Her husband's estimate that 35 minutes passed after he heard a thump in the bathroom didn't add up. While detectives' suspicions were mounting, Chief Coroner Halbert Fillinger requested an autopsy to find out why the healthy 29-year-old died so suddenly. Craig Rabinowitz refused to allow it. asserting that Jewish law demands that the body be interred before sundown the day after death, and it must remain intact. But in cases of mysterious or sudden death, the coroner can overrule religious objections unless he's given a court order.
Because of their Jewish faith, Stephanie should have been buried before the next sundown. And Dr. Fillinger was pressured by the family to release Stephanie's body so that she could be buried in accordance with her faith. And Dr. Fillinger was persistent that the body would not be released until a complete autopsy was committed.
When the body was brought in, it showed no marks, not even a bruise to indicate how the victim fell. According to Fillinger, that's not unusual.
There are injuries on the front of the body, and they occurred just prior to death or a short time prior to death. And you examine the body right after death, you may not see anything at all.
But by the time the autopsy was conducted, 12 hours after she died, the victim's wounds began to reveal themselves and the truth about her death. The medical examiners believed they were about to begin a routine autopsy on the victim of a mysterious death. Though the circumstances were tragic, examiners didn't expect them to be criminal. But they soon found themselves face to face with homicide. The first indication of foul play came with a look at the skin below the victim's eyes, where bruises made a silent accusation.
But as the blood drains away from those sites of injury, leaving the surrounding skin quite pale, then the area of bruising stands up like a beacon in the night.
Bruises such as these come from lack of oxygen, most often when a victim chokes or is choked. Strangulation was a possibility worth looking into. The victim showed no external marks around her neck, but beneath the skin, the tissue damage confirmed Fillinger's suspicions.
And of course, when we first got the body open, we found the evidence of severe strangulation, a great deal of trauma in the neck.
The mystery of Stephanie Rabinowitz's sudden death had been solved, and a homicide investigation had begun. Detectives Charlie Craig and Richard Peffel, along with prosecutor Bruce Castor, had their prime suspect, the victim's husband, Craig Rabinowitz. They questioned him in the presence of his attorney.
When Charlie came back in and advised both Rabinowitz and the attorney that Stephanie had in fact died from manual strangulation, the attorney jumped up and said, "Oh my God, she strangled herself." And both Charlie and I looked at the attorney and I said, "I don't think so."
The Rabinowitz marriage seemed picture perfect. What could have driven Craig Rabinowitz to kill his wife? Police obtained a warrant to search the house for some sign of a motive. While his wife worked as a lawyer, Craig had supposedly run a business from his home. He'd convinced a number of his friends to invest in his promising venture. But a search of the house showed no evidence of a business being conducted there. Detectives had almost given up when one of the officers found a plastic bag in a crawl space above a closet. The bag was filled with receipts and financial records. They revealed that Craig Rabinowitz had been living a lie.
When we went through the bag, we found some pretty important items, including a list or a ledger. We also found other receipts from pawn shops indicating that some jewelry had recently been pawned. And we also found receipts from furniture stores, the furniture that he had bought, apparently another woman. So during this whole case, he was pictured to be this loving, happy, devoted husband, and in this bag, we found otherwise.
A forensic accountant, skilled in deciphering complex financial transactions, reviewed the records. He found that what Craig had called a business was in fact a con game. He'd swindled his investors and convinced his trusting wife to remortgage their home. He then spent the money not on business, but to support his secret life. Credit card bills totaling $54,000 came from a single location, a strip club in Philadelphia. He'd been seeing one of the dancers there, showering her with gifts. At the time of his wife's death, Craig was hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. Desperate for money, Craig had taken out 2 insurance policies, each for $1.5 million. One was for his own life, the other for his wife. In a ledger found in the attic, Craig had calculated his net worth in the event his wife died, proving the crime was premeditated. After collecting on the insurance and paying off his debts, he'd have $1.2 million to spare. At the end of his rope, Craig turned on his unsuspecting wife and strangled her to death. He filled the bathtub, hoping to create the appearance of an accidental drowning. Then he called the police. It seemed like such a simple plan. According to Charlie Craig, far too simple.
A lot of people said to me, you know, this guy must have seen this in a movie or read it in a book. Well, as it was coming close to trial, that kind of stuck in my mind, and I got the photos back out because I remember there was some book that had something to do with death.
A book on Rabinowitz's desk had looked out of place when police searched his home. The author claimed that few deaths are followed by an autopsy.
Craig Rabinowitz was a con man. When he learned this information, that only 13% of the deaths are autopsied, Craig Rabinowitz was playing a con. He was playing the odds when he learned that information, that the odds were dramatically in his favor that Stephanie wouldn't be autopsied.
But an autopsy had been performed, exposing Craig Rabinowitz as a con man who'd gotten in too deeply. For murdering his wife, he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Lurid events take on a life of their own. On the streets of any town, people love a good scandal, especially when it involves respectable citizens. In New Orleans, a town not easily shocked, investigators found themselves in the middle of a scandal that made the Big Easy a little queasy. Just after dawn on January 22, 1984, 62-year-old Aaron Mintz frantically summoned his neighbor, a doctor. Mintz exclaimed that his wife had just shot herself. The two men rushed upstairs to the master bedroom. There, the doctor found Pam Mintz lying face up on her pillow, a bullet hole in the right side of her head. In her hand was a pistol. The doctor checked for vital signs as Mintz waited anxiously nearby. Solemnly, the doctor informed Aaron Mintz that Pam Mintz, the woman he'd been married to for 33 years, was dead. The doctor called the police to notify them of the suicide. They arrived to make a report. Detective John Dillman led the investigation.
Shortly before daybreak, or right at dawn, I received the call of a suicide at the residence of Aaron Mintz. Proceeded to that location, thinking that I was going to handle a suicide.
Investigators assessed the scene, expecting nothing out of the ordinary. But the position of her body didn't look right. They suspected the victim had been moved.
Pam's right elbow was bent in an upwards direction like this, with 2 blood stains on the bottom of her forearm coming up to a point on both sides. I questioned those stains as soon as I saw them because, as we all know, blood can't run uphill. It's against gravity.
The angle of the gun in the dead woman's hand also aroused the investigators' suspicions. It looked as though it was placed in her hand after the fact.
The gun was positioned, and this is unloaded, by the way. The gun was positioned in her hand, bent in this position, close to her head, where it would have been almost impossible to pull the trigger except with a thumb. The gun was clutched very loosely, indicating to me that the arm had been, which had originally been lying on the bed, had been bent at the elbow and raised into that position, and then the weapon had been placed into her hand to make it appear to be a suicide.
Beginning to doubt that this was truly a suicide, detectives looked for other signs of foul play. They found blood smeared on the bathroom light switch. The victim, who died instantly, couldn't have left it. And by his own admission, Aaron Mintz was the only other person in the house. But even that discovery paled in comparison to what detectives discovered next. In another bedroom, they found a pillow with a bullet hole in it. On one side were powder burns. The other side was flecked with blood. Detective Dillman was convinced that the victim was murdered and the pillow used to muffle the shot.
But once I followed this blood trail into the front of the house and found the pillow that was hidden, it didn't take a brain surgeon to, I mean, a big light just blew off. You know, John, this isn't a suicide, you have a murder on your hands.
Police launched a full-scale homicide investigation. The case seemed open and shut. The immediate suspect was the victim's husband, Aaron. There had been no one else in the house. The alarm had not been tripped. Aaron Mintz was a prominent member of the community. He denied murdering his wife. Anxious to clear his name, Mintz agreed that same day to have his hands tested for traces of gunpowder and gunmetal. If he'd fired the gun, the residue would cling to his skin. But Aaron admitted he had washed his hands before the test was conducted. The results were negative. The test failed to prove Aaron killed his wife, but neither did it prove him innocent. Investigators turned their attention to the evidence collected at the house. They focused on the bloodied pillow found in the other bedroom and the switch plate from the bathroom. In 1984, when the crime occurred, DNA testing was not yet available. But the blood type matched the victim's. Blood smears on the front and sleeve of Aaron's bathrobe also matched. Police theorized that blood got on the robe when Aaron rearranged the body. His sleeve probably touched the light switch when he went to wash his hands.
All right, so you went downstairs. You relaxed, watched a little TV, and then fell asleep?
Yes.
And what happened then?
It didn't take much digging for police to determine a possible motive. They learned that Mintz was having an affair with a young woman named Lois Porsche. Pam Mintz found out about her husband's infidelity 2 weeks before her death. She angrily confronted Aaron. She wouldn't let him go without a fight.
She didn't want him embarrassing her in public. And when Aaron began showing up in the circles of their friends with the girl that he was having the affair with, she became irate. She was going to take him for everything he was worth. And he knew it.
Investigators suspected that Aaron killed Pam so he could be free of the marriage without losing his fortune. According to their scenario, Aaron had gone to his wife's bedroom after she'd fallen asleep. He shot her in the head, using the pillow to muffle the sound so as not to alert the neighbors. That would have bought him plenty of time to rearrange the scene, making murder look like suicide. Mintz was charged with murder. To handle his defense, he hired prominent New Orleans attorney Michael Fowler. Like most of those who knew the accused, Fowler was surprised by his arrest.
I would found it most unlikely, that he would have been a subject of a homicide investigation. But by the same token, I didn't know that he was having an affair.
The case was sensationalized in the local press, which gave major coverage to the blood-stained pillow. In the court of public opinion, Aaron's guilt was a foregone conclusion. But in a court of law, the prosecution faced a serious challenge.
You realized that you had an ability to win this case, but you had to do it in terms of the forensics. You had to be able to negate a bunch of different things.
To clear Aaron Mintz, the defense relied on forensics to dismantle the prosecution's case, one piece at a time. A blood-stained bathrobe, a smeared light switch, and a bullet-pierced pillow. This was the evidence presented in the death of Pam Mintz.
I went upstairs and I found Palmer. We've been over this before.
I know that.
To the prosecution, it pointed to Aaron Mintz as a murderer.
I saw my wife dead on the bed.
But the defense saw things differently. They began with Aaron's bathrobe, smeared with his wife's blood. Aaron claimed he'd been dozing in front of the TV downstairs in the early morning. Startled awake by a loud noise, he went to investigate. When he found his wife's body and the gun in her hand, his first reaction was to take her in his arms, hugging her. According to defense attorney Michael Fowler, this scenario also explains the blood on the light switch.
After Aaron had embraced his wife, he turned the light on as he was exiting the room, made every reason why there would be blood there. There was blood on the light switch in the bathroom. That made sense because at a point he went into the bathroom and washed his hands.
The scenario explained away all but the most dramatic piece of evidence, the gunshot pillow. The prosecution argued that Aaron Mintz used the pillow to silence his gun, then removed it from Pam's bedside to conceal his crime. Again, the defense countered. Innocent of any crime, in a state of shock on discovering his wife's body, Aaron removed the pillow almost in a daze. He merely wanted to get it out of his sight without thinking how it might appear to police.
It's only significant if it's a pillow that was used in a homicide. If it's not a pillow that's used in a homicide, it's like a dirty sock. What difference does it make? He just removes it. I mean, we all do crazy things when we're under a great deal of stress.
The defense argued that since Aaron put the pillow where anyone could have found it, his purpose was not concealment.
If he wanted to hide it, he could have hid it. There was a house that sort of was full of nooks and crannies and attic space and all, and he just put it in this other room.
The defense was determined to discount the pillow completely. They stuck with the idea that Pam Mintz killed herself, but they asserted that the fatal bullet wasn't fired through the pillow. The defense had the pillow examined by Irving Stone of the Southwestern Institute for Forensic Sciences in Dallas. He set out to ascertain whether the fatal bullet was in fact fired through the pillow, as police had assumed. Using a weapon of the same caliber as the gun that killed Pam Mintz, Stone conducted tests to simulate what would happen if a gun were fired through a pillow into a human head. As a target, he used a sponge soaked in simulated blood within a heavy plastic bag. Stone shot the bag through the pillow from various distances. He demonstrated that if a pillow had been used to muffle the fatal shot, a great deal more of the victim's blood would have ended up on the pillowcase.
What would have happened as the bullet passed through the pillow into the head, with the pillow being 6 to 10 inches from the head, then there would have been backspatter of blood that would have spattered back on the reverse side of the pillow. Well, there was none of this there.
The blood on the pillow at the crime scene was hardly noticeable. By contrast, in the laboratory, blood was spattered and stained over a wide area. Stone also showed that a bullet fired through a pillow would have left fragments of the pillow behind.
You expect to find cloth, fibers, some other type of polymeric fill material at or around the wound, and actually into the wound itself. I've seen where cloth fragments have been caught by the bullet and just carried right into the wound.
There were no reports of pillow fragments on the bed where the victim was found. Likewise, the coroner found no traces of the pillow in the wound. For Stone, there was only one conclusion. The fatal bullet was not fired through the pillow. But a nagging question remained. What was the pillow doing there in the first place?
On the one hand, we had no obligation to explain the pillow. Once we were able to explain it was not used in a murder, in a homicide. On the other hand, it was there, and we had to deal with it.
The prosecution had portrayed the victim as a wronged woman, murdered so her husband could pursue his affair. But the defense painted an entirely different picture. They portrayed Pam Mintz as a vindictive woman with a long history of emotional distress. Her husband's betrayal had been too much to bear, the defense asserted. She plotted the ultimate revenge. She would kill herself, but in the process, she'd frame her husband for murder. The gunshot pillow would play a starring role. The Mintz's housekeeper testified that she'd seen the victim leaving the house the day before she died, carrying what appeared to be a pillow along with the dry cleaning. Earlier in the day, she'd seen a gun lying on Mrs. Mintz's bed. The defense suggested to the jury that Pam, out for revenge, fired a bullet through the pillow herself. Then she left it at her bedside as she prepared to end her life, knowing that it would appear that her husband had killed her. But there was no way to prove the victim had fired a pistol the day of her death. The police had made no attempt to test her hands for traces of gunpowder. Fowler believes this was a critical mistake.
Despite the fact that she was then undergoing an autopsy, or was about to undergo an autopsy, and her hands had been bagged, the police lab never swabbed her hands, so nobody ever knew, and to this day, they never know if there was any residue on her hands. They had every opportunity to do it, they just didn't do it.
If a test had shown that Pam did not fire the gun, the police would have had clear evidence the case was not a suicide. If the test had shown Pam did fire the gun, it would have cleared Aaron of guilt. But Dillman thinks the test results might have been misleading.
I did not order testing on a trace metal test on Pam Mintz's hand due to the fact that it really was irrelevant. We knew that the gun had been placed in her hands, metal had touched her hands, so any type of a trace metal test would have proved positive. That didn't prove anything.
When the case went to trial, the prosecution was confident of the evidence it presented. But the jury found otherwise, accepting the defendant's version of what happened the night Pam Mintz died. The defense claimed she'd put a bullet hole in a pillow and placed it at her bedside as she prepared to end her life. In this way, she hoped to exact retribution on her husband from beyond the grave. But careful forensic analysis of the evidence had foiled her plot. Aaron Mintz was found not guilty in the death of his wife. If hiding the body is not an option, then hiding the crime is the next best choice. But a seamless veil of deception is difficult to weave. At a crime scene, investigators are always looking to challenge their own assumptions. A battery of forensic tests gives them the means to do it. Whether an alibi is grandiose or utterly simple, if it's based on a lie, it won't withstand close scrutiny. Time and again, killers who believe otherwise are proven dead wrong. Investigators hoping to solve a difficult murder case have a creeping suspicion about who did it. But to catch the killer, they must first trap their witnesses. Detectives at the scene of a young woman's murder learn that the best tool to capture her killer may be a dustpan. Everyone's a suspect when a woman is murdered in her hotel room.
God, what's happening?
Investigators look to the killer's own hand to prove his guilt. In the absence of human bystanders, sometimes insects or even microbes can provide the most objective testimony. When death doesn't come by natural causes, solving it often depends upon a natural witness.
David 31.
In this case, some of the names have been changed.
Missing person report.
On August 4th, 1982, the Ventura County, California Sheriff's Department received a call about a missing woman. When 25-year-old Marcy Davis hadn't been heard from in almost 2 days, her sister became worried. Several hours later, the department received a call about a vehicle stuck and abandoned in a ditch. A check of the plates revealed that it belonged to Marcy Davis. There was no sign of her. She might have walked away to find help and possibly run into worse trouble. Or someone else may have ditched the vehicle. The cold engine made it impossible to determine how long it had been there. A pair of women's jeans found nearby suggested foul play. But the place was used as a dumping ground for all sorts of trash. Because the car provided the first real clue to Marcy Davis's fate, Ventura County sheriffs scoured the scene to see what else they might find. They prepared for the worst. They found it. Assigned to the case was Sergeant Larry Robertson.
The patrol division had decided that they should bring in a search and rescue team to look for the body. In fact, they did find the body. She had been found strangled and left nude, buried under leaves and debris.
Have you called forensics?
Marcy Davis's blouse had been torn and tied tightly around her neck. It appeared she might have been raped. The forensics team photographed any clues they could find in the gloom, but decided to abandon the scene until daylight. A guard was posted to keep it secure. Investigators had plenty of other work to do before sunrise.
Hey, have you seen my cigarettes? Can I take yours?
The victim's sister told police that Marcy had left the house on the night of August 3rd to go to a Tupperware party. She said that afterward she was going to JJ's, her favorite hangout.
Buy you more Tupperware?
Yes.
Hi, how you doing today?
Good. We came by, we wanted to ask you a
Detectives
couple of
talked to the
questions
bartender
about,
at JJ's.
Can you describe the men she was with?
She told them that the victim had come in around 11 the night she disappeared.
Meets with her friends.
She said that Davis was drinking and playing pool with another bar regular named Michael Nottingham. They left with all the other patrons around closing time, 2 a.m. Because Nottingham was the last person the victim had been with, investigators went to see him.
At the time, we feared that perhaps Michael Nottingham was with her, and he also had been a homicide victim. And we just hadn't found his body yet. So number one, we were trying to establish whether or not his well-being could be verified.
They found him safe at home. He agreed to come to the station to talk. They showed him a photograph of Marcy that her sister provided.
That's Teresa.
He recognized the face, but not the name.
She told you her name is Teresa? That's what she said.
He knew her as Teresa.
This is...
She gave him a ride home, came in for about 10 minutes, then left. That's the last he saw of her, he said.
Wait, license is suspended? No, I just don't have a call.
Nottingham told them that after she drove off around 3 a.m., he walked to his girlfriend's house and crashed outside until her mother left at 9:30. He said that nobody saw him during that time. After Nottingham gave his statement, police went to the house he shared with his sister. They wanted to speak with her to see if she could confirm his alibi. She recognized the face in the picture as a woman Michael came home with the other night. She corroborated his account of the time spent at home, up to a point. She said he introduced the woman as Kelly, and that wasn't the only difference.
She recalled that Michael and Kelly both got into her car and left together. Obviously, this was very different from the statements that Michael had given to us.
The sheriff's department now had a conflicting story and a 6-hour gap in Michael Nottingham's alibi.
Be the right foot sticking up. Okay.
Suspicion was building, but they had nothing solid.
Directs a couple of depth. That's where we are. Some cigarettes.
Any forensic clues found in the victim's car would only support Nottingham's account that he'd been in it.
Go up and give us some aerials.
Investigators needed something to prove that Nottingham had been at the crime scene.
Right about here. Okay. And the body's up here. Okay. Okay, now what's going on?
Okay, what I found...
By the light of day, investigators returned to the scene to search for any clues to link him there. The lengthy process left no stone or leaf unturned.
While processing this scene, I sat on the ground in the immediate vicinity of the body, and as we were taking leaf and branches off one at a time looking for evidence, I sat on the ground next to the body for, I would say, at least an hour, perhaps an hour and a half.
Yeah, with this we found about 6 feet away from the vehicle, cigarette butts.
Investigators found a tentative clue, a filterless cigarette butt on the ground near the abandoned vehicle matched Nottingham's brand. The clue was weak, but coupled with the conflicting stories, it allowed police to arrest Nottingham on suspicion of rape and murder. All they had to do now was prove it. Nottingham was taken into custody. As a matter of course, for cases of sexual assault, he was stripped and photographed.
Take off your shirt for us.
Investigators looked for scratches, scrapes, or any other evidence to indicate he may have struggled with his victim. they found something else entirely.
What about the,
As many as 100 small and unusual insect bites dotted his ankles and waistline. Nottingham said they were flea bites. Investigators weren't sure of their significance, but they documented the marks just in case. That night, Sergeant Robertson was awakened by itching around his ankles and waist. He recognized the unforgettable symptoms.
I told my wife if I didn't know better, I would say that these bites on me that itched profusely were chigger bites, and they were just exactly like the chigger bites I had experienced in guerrilla warfare training in Kentucky during the Vietnam era.
that these are the sites where they normally attack?
After his physician confirmed his diagnosis, detectives wondered if these little creatures could somehow provide their big break.
I've got a ball in here.
They needed an expert's advice. They consulted entomologist James Webb, who specializes in parasitic insects. He told them that chiggers are larvae, the newly hatched spawn of a certain group of mites. They're born with a voracious appetite and are adept at procuring their meal.
And they insert their mouth parts into the host's skin, and then with this special blade, there's one on each side, and then they'll actually inject saliva into the wound, and the saliva then dissolves the protein of the skin, and that pool of liquid then is actually sucked into the chigger with a special gut pump. It brings the material into the intestine, into the gut of the chigger.
The saliva triggers the host's immune system, causing a red, itchy bump around the bite, usually within 24 to 48 hours. A survey of the investigators who searched the scene of Marcy Davis's murder revealed that most bore the telltale marks of a chigger attack.
It's not by the individual bite that we recognize the chigger bite. We recognize it more as a pattern, and usually at a place where there's constriction of clothing. Because the chigger, when the chigger moves up the body, it'll stop along the sock line, or the panty line, or the underwear line, or the belt line.
Out of a case with no real clues, a pattern began to emerge. Michael Nottingham's bite marks were carefully photographed again, at life size. It appeared the murder might have had dozens of witnesses after all. Investigators hoped that by catching chiggers, they could catch Marcy Davis's killer.
I think we can do it before the sun
Suspect
goes in.
Michael Nottingham swore he'd never been to the area where the victim's body was found. Sergeant Larry Robertson believed the chigger bites on Nottingham's body might tell a different story.
But I had never, ever experienced chiggers in all my years of living in Ventura County. Even though I was active in search and rescue and hunting and fishing, I had never heard of chiggers in Ventura County, and never seen them, and had never read about them in Ventura County.
In fact, they were exceedingly rare in this part of California. If investigators could isolate chiggers to the crime scene, they would have undeniable proof that Nottingham had been there. They called on Dr. Webb for help.
The thing we wanted to do at the crime scene was see if there were chigger mites there to substantiate this hypothesis. And we knew that lizards are good indicators of finding chiggers.
Chiggers attach to lizards and feed off them. Traps were laid to catch the lizards for examination. Once they were found to be infested, Webb and his team broke out the chigger traps. A chigger trap is nothing more than a small black plastic plate. that's placed where chiggers are likely to gather. The sun heats it up, providing a warm welcome for the pesky larvae. These creatures are hungry, not smart.
This thing is a warm body, much like a living animal. And so the chiggers, if they're in the vicinity, will move towards the plate and crawl around on the plate, looking for a place to attach.
Webb's team set their traps outside the house of Nottingham's girlfriend, where Nottingham claimed he spent the night sleeping. They placed more traps 20 feet away from the murder scene, and others even closer to the spot where the victim had been found. They checked the traps every half hour during daylight for 3 days. The results were clear.
Not too far from the murder scene, where the body was found, we were getting 10s or 20 or more at a time running around in the black plate. I mean, just large numbers. We also noticed them running around in our shoes when we were standing in that same spot and crawling up onto us.
But just 20 feet away from the body, the chigger activity was minimal. And at the girlfriend's house, they found none at all. The proximity of the chiggers to the victim established Nottingham's presence at the crime scene.
I believe from our research, this was the first time that entomology had ever been used in a capital case or murder case to assist investigators in placing the suspect at the scene of the crime.
From what police could piece together, the victim drove Nottingham to the woods. Maybe she wanted to go, maybe he forced her to go there. Once there, they began to fight. It escalated, and Nottingham beat and killed her, finally strangling her with her shirt. Michael Nottingham was convicted of attempted rape and the first-degree murder of Marcy Davis. He was sentenced to life without possibility of parole. Danger can lurk on the outskirts of town, or it may lurk even closer to home. Seattle, Washington. Once a rugged forest land, now it's a world-class city of 500,000. Some people come here to take advantage of new opportunities. Others come here just to take advantage. 28-year-old Molly McClure had grown up in Seattle and had been away a few years. In October 1985, she moved back to be closer to her family. She rented a modest apartment and found a job she loved as a hotel restaurant consultant. In January 1986, she called the police to report an attempted break-in at her apartment. Her upstairs neighbor, Sherwood Knight, told her he'd seen someone trying to jimmy her window while he was out for his morning jog. He scared the intruder off. The tampering on the window was plain to see. The police made out a report. That seemed like the end of it. But the next day, January 17th, police were called once again to McClure's apartment. They arrived there at the request of her boss, who had phoned them when she failed to show up for work and didn't answer her phone. Officers found her door locked and noticed what appeared to be some new damage to the window. Fearing that McClure might be in trouble, the officers slipped inside. They saw no signs of disturbance. Nothing seemed out of place. Then, in the bedroom, they found Molly McClure murdered in her bed.
Headquarters, we got a homicide over here.
Does it seem to be working that way?
Homicide was called in. Detective Hank Gruber was assigned to the case.
The young lady was laying face down on the bed, and she was partly covered with a blanket, but her head was exposed. She had obvious wounds to the back of her head. There was a gag in her mouth with panties, and they were tied with a sock.
The medical examiner was able to tell from the hemorrhages in the victim's eyes that she had been strangled. From the degree to which blood had pooled in her body, the ME could tell she had been dead 4 or 5 hours. While the apartment was processed for fingerprints or any other clues, the medical examiner carefully collected visible fibers and loose hairs from the body. The intensity of the crime scene processing was momentarily broken. Sherwood Knight came by to return a cookbook he'd borrowed.
The neighbor from upstairs?
How you doing? We're just doing a little checking around here. May I have your name?
He was concerned about Molly and stunned to hear that she was dead.
Oh, this was book I got.
I'll tell you what, I'd like to do some more talking.
The detective sent him on his way and went back to processing the scene. The Washington State Crime Lab would scrutinize the trace evidence they gathered. Detectives hoped that the solution to this case, if it existed at all, lay somewhere in these small bags.
We had no idea who did this. It wasn't like there were any witnesses or anything to go on, and the case was easily recognized as a case that, if it was going to be solved, would have to be done with trace evidence.
Whoever had tried to invade McClure's apartment the night before had evidently returned to finish what he'd started. From the looks of it, Molly McClure's killer came in through the window of the spare bedroom. There, investigators found a footprint on the sill that didn't match the officer's shoes. This was their first clue that was bigger than a hair, and it needed to be preserved. After the sill was photographed, technicians collected it.
If you can actually take the item that has the print on it, you have a way better chance of being successful in comparisons than through pictures. The actual item is always better. So we took the windowsill at that time, and we had our samples from around the house.
The print on the windowsill had to wait until investigators could find a shoe to compare it with. While the trace evidence was being analyzed, detectives sought to find rhyme or reason for the crime. The curious thing was why the culprit made 2 attempts to enter the victim's apartment. Detectives thought that McClure might have been a victim of circumstance. The couple that lived in the apartment before her had a history of domestic violence.
Can I help you?
The boyfriend had moved out several months earlier. Police theorized that he might have returned to kill his former girlfriend, not realizing that she too had moved away.
Yes, sir. Okay. Yeah, she's married. She's here. Hey, Christy, you want to come on out?
But when police paid him a visit, they found the couple had reconciled.
Hi.
Though the victim's apartment wasn't ransacked, police noticed her jewelry box was empty. A check of bank records showed that the victim's cash machine card was used at an ATM several blocks away around the time of her death. So in addition to murder and rape, the killer had come there to rob. At autopsy, the medical examiner determined that the rapist's blood was type O, but so was the victim's. no more detailed analysis could be performed on the samples. The medical examiner sent the trace evidence from the sheets to the state crime lab, where it was analyzed by supervising forensic scientist Chesterine Swicklick, now with Swicklick and Associates. She can tell a great deal from small fibers.
Everybody has a characteristic set of debris on them. Everybody has just particles and fibers which may be found on nobody else in the world. We shed our hairs. We go to work and pick up fibers from the seat that we're sitting on, and we may pick up, if the person who worked there with us has a dog and deposit dog hairs on that seat, we pick up some of those dog hairs, and it then becomes part of our set of debris.
Every time we're in contact with someone, we swap some of our debris. At a crime scene, it's up to forensics to determine whose is whose. Swicklick identified a piece of lint from clothing, blue synthetic fibers, a flake of tobacco removed from under the victim's fingernail, some cat hair, and 18 fragments of dark human hair. She determined that characteristics of the hair suggested it was from an African American. It was definitely not that of blonde, blue-eyed Molly McClure. Detectives returned to the scene to collect more clues. The debris didn't seem like the victim's, as she was also a non-smoker who was allergic to cats. But if the killer had left these traces, they would be concentrated around the victim and not elsewhere in the apartment. They collected samples of the debris from the floor of each room, moving to the corners where it tends to gather. They found no cat fur, no tobacco, no African American hairs. A picture of the killer was emerging out of the dust. He could have been an anonymous intruder or someone closer to home. In a murder investigation, it's easier to eliminate familiar faces before looking for new suspects. Sherwood Knight, who had frightened off the burglar at the victim's window, had been helpful in the investigation, but detectives ran a check on him anyway. Gruber's partner, Detective Rudy Sutlovich, discovered that Knight had a record.
And he had a history of robberies and burglaries and other assaults. And he had been released from prison approximately 3 months prior to this.
Thank you very much. Officer Smith here with me.
Detectives paid a visit to Sherwood Knight and his girlfriend. The couple lived in the apartment above the victims. Knight's girlfriend told detectives that they had had a fight the night McClure was murdered.
And so then you came back, noticed
Sherwood slept on the couch. She told police that she woke around 5:30 a.m.
I don't think so.
Knight was already out for his morning jog. He came home a short time later, wearing his jogging clothes like he always did. Then he rushed off for his class at North Seattle Community College.
He was enrolled there, but nobody could ever remember seeing him. Didn't go to his classes or anything, but he had been telling his girlfriend that he was going to school during the daytime.
Based on his past record, investigators thought Knight might be guilty of more than playing hooky.
I got it.
Detective Sutlovich, I have a search warrant.
A search
Please step
warrant?
aside, please. Yes, we have some work we need to do here.
On January 21st, 4 days after the murder, detectives served a search warrant on Knight's apartment.
Questions at this point.
They were authorized to gather trace evidence collected from the corners of the apartment. Fiber samples from blankets, cat hair, the clothing Knight was said to have worn the night of the murder, and even the clothing he wore when they served the warrant. As it turned out, he was wearing the sweatshirt he usually jogged in.
Shirt, pants, shoes too, please.
Detectives found the jogging pants soaking in a bucket of water.
Yep.
They collected the pants, bucket and all.
Thanks.
Knight was read his rights and taken into custody. There, his hair, blood, and saliva samples were collected. Authorities could hold him no longer than 48 hours unless the tests turned up evidence to directly link him to the crime.
Hold still.
The shoe print left on the victim's windowsill matched the tread on running shoes taken from the suspect. But the sneaker was common, and the print would match thousands of others all over Seattle. Testing the trace evidence was more time-consuming. The pants had to be dried before they were looked at. The fibers had to be scrutinized one by one. Even matching hairs is tricky because two hairs taken from the same person might not necessarily match.
If you just look at your own hair, the hair of someone who's sitting next to you, you could see some hairs are thicker, some are thinner, some are darker, some are lighter, some are coarser, some are finer.
The 48 hours came and went without a definitive result. Knight had to be released. But little by little, the trace evidence began to tell the bigger story. The distinctive shape and pattern of some hairs revealed that they were from a cat. Their length and color matched Knight's pet. Then, Swicklick analyzed Sherwood Knight's pants. Red cotton fibers and cat hair were entangled in pills of lint found clinging to them. The pills matched the lint found on the victim. She still wasn't satisfied.
Even though it's very compelling evidence, I would have to say there is a possibility it could have come from another pair of pants with red cotton and with cat hairs. Cats are not a rare species. The red cotton is not unusual.
As her testing continued, more fibers on the victim matched other items taken from Knight's apartment. His hairs, too, matched those from the crime scene. As incriminating as that evidence seemed to be, investigators feared that no jury would buy a case that was solved by lint and cat hair. They sought an array of evidence since no single irrefutable piece had been found. But they were getting closer. They discovered telltale bloodstains around the waistband of Knight's sweatshirt. The droplets had apparently escaped Knight's notice. Technicians tested them against the suspect's and victim's own blood. Though tests weren't as precise in the 1980s as they are today, the blood was found to be consistent with the victim's, a Caucasian with type O. Now investigators had blood as well as hair and fibers to implicate the suspect.
All these little circumstances would not be sufficient to charge somebody with a murder or any crime. But accumulating each one of these little circumstances, they all add up so long as they're all consistent with the same conclusion, which is that Sherwood Knight was in Molly's apartment that morning and that he's the one who committed the murder.
Investigators were ready to bring him in. The only problem was where to find him. When Seattle police went to arrest Sherwood Knight for the murder of Molly McClure, they learned he'd fled. A manhunt eventually led to an informant who told police of his whereabouts.
How about you, partner? Change the car.
On April 23rd, Sherwood Knight was arrested.
You got to go with me. What?
Based on the evidence and interviews with Knight's acquaintances, a picture of the victim's last hours came into focus. Sherwood Knight had faked the first break-in so that he could scope out the victim's apartment while winning her trust. The next night, he broke in, attacked, and killed her, but not before forcing her to reveal her cash machine password. For his crimes, Sherwood Knight received life without parole. The McClure case was solved on the combined weight of tiny fibers, a drop of blood, and a few strands of cat hair. In a hotel in Ohio, investigators had even less to link a killer to the crime scene. Blue Ash, Ohio is a quiet town just outside of Cincinnati. People here guard their privacy. In this story, the names of the victim and her family have been changed. On September 3rd, 1994, Bert Stein and June Mays had come to Blue Ash for a family reunion. They'd left their sister, Rose Levy, in the room while they went to breakfast. Rose had promised to join them, but hadn't made it.
Oh my goodness, Rose.
I don't know.
Rose, is she breathing?
A joyful occasion turned into a family tragedy when they discovered 68-year-old Rose collapsed on the floor of their suite. They had been gone only 30 minutes.
Hello, desk.
She clung to life,
This is
but
room
just
220.
barely.
Yeah, there's somebody down. Please send somebody.
From the looks of it, she had suffered a heart attack or a stroke.
Move back. Everybody please move back.
Medical technicians raced to save her. Police arrived too, as part of their normal procedure. Rose Levy died in the hospital. It wasn't a heart attack or stroke that killed her. She had been beaten to death. By the time the victim reached the hospital, bruises and welts had begun to form. Among them were heel marks on her chest and a strange rectangular mark evidently caused by the murder weapon. The medical examiner couldn't discern what it was. Further examination revealed that 2 of the victim's teeth had been knocked out and several bones in her face had been fractured. The damage she received was equal to what a body endures when it hits a brick wall at 40 miles per hour. This was the unforgettable face of a homicide. Blue Ash, Ohio police launched an investigation. The room was cordoned off and scoured for clues. Determining the useful clues wasn't easy. Assigned to the case were detectives Jim Schaefer and Larry Stokes.
The crime scene was extremely contaminated by the time investigators got there, but it was only because of the attempts to resuscitate her.
Detective Jim Schaefer.
Besides blood, there was a footprint that was discovered in the bathroom and a lot of other items that were later found to be items left by rescue workers.
Rose, you awake? Are you there?
According to June Mays and Bert Stein, Rose was still dressing when they were ready to go to breakfast.
Oh, yes. Yeah,
She told the couple to go ahead without her.
all right, don't forget
She'd
they
be
start
down in a
serving
minute
at
to join them.
11:30. Okay. Okay? All right. No, she's going to take a shower.
She never made it. As the investigation continued, some items were discovered missing. Mays, who left her purse in the room while she was at breakfast, noticed that $500 was taken from it.
Thank you, ma'am.
And where did you leave that purse?
Later, the victim's family realized that when Rose was rushed to the hospital, she wasn't wearing a favorite ring and the custom-made pendant she never removed. They didn't turn up in a search of the room. Investigators recovered one of the victim's teeth from the carpet, but could find nothing to link a suspect to the robbery homicide. Stokes and Schaefer had their work cut out for them. Every guest and every employee was a potential witness or a potential suspect. According to Schaefer, everyone had to be questioned.
With the chart of the over 100 hotel employees and over 300 guests, we started in on establishing alibis or whereabouts for each of those individuals.
As detectives began the chore of sending surveys to guests in order to locate potential witnesses, they narrowed the field of potential suspects. The killer could only have struck during the 30 minutes that Bert and June were at breakfast. The door to the room locked automatically, so a person would have to have been let in or would have needed a key to gain entry. Detectives focused on hotel employees who worked that shift and had access to pass keys. They asked each employee to account for his whereabouts during that half hour and to name someone who could vouch for him.
The main object of this investigation at that point became, let's find out who can alibi for who during this time period, and the one person that will not have an alibi will be someone definitely worth looking at.
Investigators knew that it took a sick man to commit a crime this brutal. They were closer to the truth than they ever imagined. Detectives Schaefer and Stokes began to make progress on the Rose Levy homicide investigation as they culled the list of hotel employees. One employee made mention of Elwood Jones, a co-worker who had called in sick with a hand injury. Jones had filed for workers' compensation, saying he'd cut his hand on a metal stairwell on the job. Detectives called him in for an interview. He was one of the only employees who had no alibi during that fatal half hour. They wanted to know more about his injury. They went to Bethesda Oak Hospital, bringing along a court order giving them access to Elwood Jones's records. Jones had checked into the emergency room of the hospital 3 days after the murder with a serious hand injury. The small cut above the knuckle of his left index finger had already sealed up, but an infection festered within.
Oh, well, what's this?
Jones's hand was severely swollen and intensely painful.
Say you did.
He was running a fever.
You did.
Hand surgeon John McDonough was called in to examine the wound.
This was a tremendous blow that he had taken to his hand because it tore the capsule of the joint and inoculated the bacteria directly into the finger joint. It would take a significant amount of pressure to have that occur.
When McDonough asked Jones what happened, he said he'd cut it on a dumpster at work. Not only did that seem unlikely, it also contradicted what he told the staff earlier. Jones was left-handed. To McDonough, the position of the wound above the knuckle of the dominant hand indicated that the patient probably was wounded as he punched someone in the mouth. In fact, the injury was so characteristic of a so-called fight bite that McDonough had it photographed to use in his classes. If that were really the cause, McDonough wasn't surprised that his patient lied about it.
People that have human bite injuries try to hide them, try to make light of them, tell you they did something else, like brushing their hand against the wall or cutting it on a dumpster.
The wound, whatever had caused it, called for immediate surgery. McDonough opened and drained it. He reserved some of the fluid so that the infectious bacteria could be cultured and studied. Once it was identified, the proper antibiotic could be prescribed. A human mouth, even a clean one, is home to 42 species of bacteria. Someone with poor dental hygiene can have more. A human bite can be akin to being cut with an object from the bottom of a sewer. At the hospital microbiology lab, the bacteria from Elwood Jones's wound was incubated until the sample grew large enough to be recognizable. Culturing bacteria can happen overnight or take more than a week. Larry Gray is the director of the lab.
The technologist on the workup bench will look at the plates. They will look at the organisms, the texture, how large they are, the colonies, the size, the color.
The result is then stained, revealing more characteristics of the species when examined under a microscope. Finally, the bacterium is identified and antibiotics are administered.
Jones, how are you feeling
Jones
today?
stayed in the hospital while his infection was
Good.
being treated.
How's the hand?
After 5 days, he went home.
Yeah, I'll get a copy of this and put it in his record.
The doctor told the detectives that Jones's hand was infected with Eikenella corrodens. It's a somewhat rare bacterium that thrives on dental plaque below the gum line.
And then this slide over
To
here
find it
is
inside
the,
a man's knuckle
surgical
required
slide
some
where we
explaining.
opened it up and showed the tear in the capsule.
McDonough explained it.
When the hand strikes a tooth, the tooth may be broken or the sharp edge inoculates bacteria, and in this case, Eikenella corrodens, deep inside the tissue. I've been doing hand surgery for almost 25 years, and I've only seen 3 cases of Eikenella infection. All 3 of those were associated with a human bite injury.
Detectives felt that Jones could have contracted Eikenella from striking Rose Levy. Now they had what they needed to isolate Jones as the prime suspect. But Jones offered an explanation. He said that after he cut himself on the dumpster, he sucked the wound to clean it. Less than 3/10 of the population has Eikenella bacteria in its saliva, but authorities had to be sure. They swabbed the inside of Jones's mouth and sent the swabs to the lab to be cultured. The results came back. They were negative. The infection was consistent with injuries incurred during the beating death of Rose Levy, and the rarity of the Eikenella infection was enough for detectives to serve a search warrant on the apartment Jones shared with his girlfriend. They confiscated his shoes so they could compare their heel marks with bruises found on the victim. Jones's car was impounded and searched for fiber, blood, or other trace evidence to tie him to the crime. But the most compelling evidence was visible to the naked eye, a hotel passkey. And in a toolbox in the trunk lay the victim's missing pendant. Jones was arrested for the murder of Rose Levy. Prior to his trial, the bruising patterns on the victim were digitally enhanced and the murder weapon was revealed. The marks corresponded with the walkie-talkie that Jones carried on the job. His shoes also matched bruises found on the body. Based on the evidence, investigators put together the events in the hotel room. When Jones saw Bert Stein and June Mays leave for breakfast, he thought the coast was clear for robbery. The suite they shared usually had only 2 occupants. Jones had no reason to believe that September 2nd was any different. He used his passkey to enter. He didn't expect a witness.
Excuse me?
He knew he couldn't afford one. The murder accusation came from the victim's own mouth. On December 11, 1996, Elwood Jones was convicted of aggravated burglary, aggravated robbery, and aggravated murder. Because of the violent nature of the crime, he was sentenced to death. The perfect murder has no witnesses. The perfect killer leaves no trail. But the sheer act of murder disrupts the natural order of things and always leaves traces behind. Science is learning how to read those traces, no matter how insignificant they may first appear to be.